My name is John Terry, and the strangest thing about being called a risk to your own company is that it happened on the same day people were supposed to celebrate your life. On the morning of my 70th birthday, I woke up before sunrise the way I had for nearly 4 decades. Old habits have a way of surviving even when success tells you they no longer need to exist. The city outside my apartment was still dark as I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window. Most people looking at my life would have assumed I had already won. Terry Lotus Salon had grown from a tiny storefront with 2 manicure stations into one of the most respected beauty brands in the region. We operated multiple locations, employed hundreds of people, and generated more revenue than I ever dreamed possible when I arrived in America, carrying 2 suitcases and less than $300. Yet that morning, none of the numbers mattered to me. What mattered was that I was 70 years old. 70. The number felt unreal. I still remembered sleeping on the floor of a 1-bedroom apartment shared with 3 other immigrants. I still remembered eating instant noodles for weeks because every extra dollar went toward opening my first salon. I still remembered my wife Linda standing beside me in that tiny shop, smiling at customers even on days when we barely had enough money to pay rent. Success never erased those memories. If anything, it made them sharper. Around 10 o'clock, I arrived at our flagship location. The moment I stepped inside, applause erupted from every direction. Balloons decorated the reception area. Fresh flowers sat on every station. Someone had even arranged photographs from different stages of my career along one wall. There I was at 32, standing beside the first Terry Lotus sign. There I was at 45, opening our 3rd location. There I was at 60, receiving a local business leadership award. Looking at those pictures felt like watching someone else's life. "Happy birthday, boss," Kim Lu shouted from across the room. I smiled immediately. Kim had been with me for 24 years. She started as a receptionist shortly after her divorce, and eventually became one of the most trusted managers in the entire company. If Terry Lotus had a heartbeat, Kim was part of it. She walked over, carrying a small gift bag, and hugged me. 70 years old? She said. "I still don't believe it." "Neither do I replied. The morning passed in a blur of laughter, stories, and customers stopping to offer congratulations. Several employees who had transferred to other locations even drove in just to attend the celebration. Moments like that meant more to me than revenue reports ever could. Businesses survive because of people. I learned that lesson long ago. Shortly after noon, my daughter Audrey arrived with her husband Brett and their 11-year-old daughter Ava. Seeing Ava immediately improved my mood. She ran across the salon and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Happy birthday, Grandpa," she shouted. "Thank you, sweetheart." Audrey smiled politely and handed me a gift box. We had grown more distant over the years than either of us liked to admit, but I still loved her. She was my only child. Brett followed a few steps behind, carrying a laptop bag. That struck me as unusual. Most people don't bring presentation equipment to birthday parties. Still, I ignored the thought. Throughout the afternoon, more guests arrived. Former employees, suppliers, longtime clients. Even several local business owners stopped by. By 6 o'clock, the salon was filled with people sharing stories about the company and the role it had played in their lives. Looking around the room, I felt proud, not because of the money, because of the community. Every face represented years of trust, years of work, years of relationships. Then Brett stood up and tapped a spoon against a glass. The room gradually became quiet. "Before we cut the cake," he said, "I'd like to say a few words. I expected a toast, maybe a speech about family, maybe a funny story." Instead, Brett connected his laptop to a large television mounted near the reception desk. The screen flickered to life. A title slide appeared. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was seeing. Then the words became clear. Strategic Future Assessment. Several people exchanged confused glances. Brett clicked to the next slide. Charts appeared, graphs, revenue projections, market analyses. The atmosphere shifted immediately. This no longer felt like a birthday celebration. It felt like a boardroom meeting. Brett began discussing industry trends, modernization, brand positioning, and growth opportunities. The room grew quieter with every passing minute. Employees who had spent the afternoon laughing now looked increasingly uncomfortable. I glanced toward Audrey. She avoided eye contact. That worried me more than anything, Brett was saying. Then another slide appeared. This one contained a single photograph. Mine. Beneath it, in bold red letters, were two words that instantly drained every ounce of joy from the room. Founder risk. And in that moment, on my 70th birthday, I realized this gathering had never been a celebration at all. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The words founder risk remained frozen on the screen behind Brett like some kind of accusation. I stood near the cake table staring at my own photograph while an uncomfortable silence settled across the salon. Every employee in the room seemed equally confused. Some looked at me, others looked at Brett. A few glanced toward Audrey as if expecting her to explain what was happening. She didn't. Brett smiled confidently and clicked to the next slide. I know this might seem surprising, he said, but successful companies must prepare for difficult conversations. The room remained silent. Terry Lotus has achieved incredible success, he continued. No one is denying that. John built something remarkable. However, modern businesses must evaluate long-term sustainability. I felt my stomach tighten. There are moments when you realize a conversation is headed somewhere unpleasant, long before everyone else notices. This was one of those moments. Brett pointed toward a graph showing projected revenue growth over the next 10 years. The beauty industry is changing rapidly, he explained. Consumer expectations are changing. Investor expectations are changing. Competitors are evolving. Another click, another slide. This one displayed several luxury beauty brands alongside Terry Lotus. A red circle highlighted our company. Our biggest challenge, Brett said, is perception. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Kim folded her arms across her chest. Perception? She asked. Brett nodded. The market increasingly views Terry Lotus as a founder-centered organization. Nobody seemed impressed by that observation. Brett continued anyway. When a company's identity becomes too closely tied to a single individual, growth becomes restricted. I finally spoke. Brett, what exactly does this have to do with my birthday? A few people laughed nervously. Brett didn't. Everything, he replied. Because leadership transitions should happen before they're forced by circumstances. The room became even quieter. The implication was obvious. Age, retirement, mortality. Things nobody expected to discuss while standing beside a birthday cake. Brett advanced another slide. This one featured a new logo, large silver letters against a black background. Lux Edge Beauty Group. I had never seen the name before, neither had anyone else. What is that? Kim asked immediately. Brett smiled. The future. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The future of what? The future of this company. Several employees began whispering among themselves. Brett walked toward the screen like a consultant presenting to investors. The Terry Lotus name has tremendous historical value, he said. But history doesn't always create growth. Modern consumers respond to innovation, luxury positioning, and fresh branding. He pointed toward the logo. Lux Edge Beauty Group creates expansion opportunities impossible under the current structure. I looked around the room. The expressions I saw weren't excitement. They were confusion and discomfort. This wasn't a strategy meeting. These people came to celebrate. Instead, they were being forced to watch a corporate takeover presentation. Brett continued speaking about market opportunities, acquisition strategies, investor interest, and future valuations. Every sentence seemed designed to reduce decades of sacrifice into a spreadsheet. Then he revealed the part that finally made everything clear. Several interested parties have already expressed enthusiasm regarding a potential transaction. My eyes narrowed immediately. Transaction, not partnership, not expansion. Transaction. There was only one reason people used that word. You're talking about selling the company. The room went completely silent. Brett didn't even hesitate. Yes, no apology. No discomfort, no concern about timing. Just yes. Like he was discussing a routine business decision instead of the life's work of two people who sacrificed everything to build it. Selling Terry Lotus would unlock enormous value. I turned toward Audrey. Finally, you knew about this? Her eyes dropped toward the floor. That answer hurt more than any presentation ever could. Audrey? She hesitated before speaking. Brett and I have discussed several possibilities. Several possibilities. Such careful words. Such distant words. I suddenly realized neither of them had come here to celebrate my birthday. They came expecting a business negotiation. Brett clicked another slide. Numbers appeared. Large numbers. Estimated sale values. Projected investor returns. Growth forecasts. He spoke enthusiastically while employees stood frozen around him. Then he reached into his laptop bag and removed a thin folder. My pulse immediately quickened. He walked across the room and placed it directly in front of me. "This is only a preliminary authorization," he said. "Nothing binding, just permission to begin formal discussions." I stared at the folder without touching it. Around me, the salon had become completely silent. Every employee seemed to understand the significance of that document. Brett smiled as though everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Take your time," he said. "But I think once you review the numbers, you'll realize this is the smartest decision for everyone involved." And, for the first time that evening, I began to suspect that Brett wasn't simply trying to sell a company. He was trying to erase everything that made it worth building in the first place. Nobody touched the folder. It sat on the reception desk between Brett and me like an unwelcome guest. Around us, the celebration had completely vanished. The birthday decorations suddenly looked ridiculous beside financial projections and acquisition forecasts. For several seconds, the only sound in the salon came from the soft hum of the ventilation system. Then Brett cleared his throat and smiled again. It was the smile of a man convinced he was the smartest person in the room. "I understand this may feel emotional," he said, "but good leadership requires objectivity." Kim immediately rolled her eyes. Brett either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. He clicked to the next slide. A new chart appeared. Employee compensation, department costs, labor efficiency metrics. My stomach tightened again. I knew exactly where this was heading. Brett pointed a laser pointer toward several highlighted names. One of the challenges facing Terry Lotus is legacy staffing. Several employees exchanged confused glances. The phrase sounded less like people and more like inventory. "Legacy staffing?" Kim asked. Brett nodded. "Employees retained primarily because of historical loyalty rather than measurable performance optimization." The room grew noticeably colder. Every person there understood what he was really saying. Brett clicked again. This time, a photograph appeared on the screen. Kim's photograph. My jaw tightened instantly. Kim looked equally shocked. "Brett," Audrey whispered. But it was the weakest protest imaginable, more caution than objection. Brett continued anyway. "Kim Liu has been with the company 24 years. He smiled politely. An admirable level of dedication. Something about his tone made the compliment sound like an insult. Then came the next sentence. "Unfortunately, loyalty doesn't always equal efficiency." The room erupted into murmurs. Several employees looked genuinely offended. Kim herself remained silent, though I could see the hurt in her eyes. Brett pointed toward a graph. Based on market standards, managerial restructuring could reduce labor expenditures significantly. He paused before delivering the line that changed the atmosphere completely. "In business terms, individuals like Kim represent dead weight carried by emotional decision-making." The silence that followed felt explosive. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked at Kim. For 24 years, she'd helped build this company. She'd worked through illnesses, recessions, staffing shortages, and economic downturns. When my wife Linda was dying from cancer, Kim practically ran operations by herself so I could spend time at the hospital. When our third location suffered flood damage, Kim slept in the building 3 nights straight coordinating repairs. Dead weight. The phrase echoed in my head. Finally, I stood up. "Take that slide down." Brett blinked. "John, let's stay focused on the data." "Take it down." The smile disappeared from his face. For the first time all evening, he looked slightly uncomfortable. Slowly, he lowered the remote control. Nobody spoke. I walked toward the screen and looked directly at Kim's photograph. Then I turned back toward the crowd. "Do you know why Terry Lotus survived the financial crisis?" I asked. Nobody answered. "Kim," I pointed toward her. "Do you know who trained nearly every manager in this company?" Again, nobody answered. "Kim." My voice grew stronger. "Do you know who covered shifts when employees had family emergencies? Who organized charity events? Who mentored hundreds of young women starting their careers?" I paused. "Kim." Several employees nodded. A few even clapped softly. Brett looked increasingly irritated. I wasn't finished. This company was never built on efficiency reports. I looked around the room. It was built on people. More applause followed. Kim's eyes were beginning to water. Brett folded his arms. "That's a very inspiring speech," he said. "But investors don't purchase sentiment." I laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because I finally understood the size of the problem standing in front of me. "That's exactly why you'll never understand this company." The room went silent again. Brett's expression hardened. For a brief moment, something ugly flashed across his face. Contempt. Not just for Kim, not just for me. For everyone in the room who didn't see the world the way he did. Then he glanced toward Audrey. I expected her to say something. Anything. Instead, she remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. That hurt almost as much as Brett's comments, because silence can sometimes feel like agreement. Eventually, Brett picked up his laptop and began clicking through additional employee reports. I stopped paying attention. Instead, I found myself studying him, really studying him. And that's when I noticed something strange. A notification briefly appeared on the screen connected to his laptop. Most people would have ignored it. I almost did. But one name caught my attention before the notification disappeared. Neil Barker. The message vanished too quickly to read completely. Yet the few visible words were enough to make my pulse quicken. Ready when he signs. That was all I saw. Nothing more, nothing less. But suddenly the folder on the desk made a lot more sense. Because for the first time that evening, I began to suspect Brett wasn't planning a sale. I suspected he had already promised one. The notification disappeared almost instantly, but the damage had already been done. Neil Barker, ready when he signs. Those 5 words continued echoing in my head, while Brett resumed talking about valuations, restructuring opportunities, and future growth. I barely heard any of it. My attention remained fixed on a much larger question. If someone named Neil Barker was waiting for me to sign something, then why was Brett presenting this as a discussion? Discussions happen before agreements, not after. Around me, the employees looked increasingly uncomfortable. Several had stopped pretending to pay attention. Others were quietly gathering their belongings. What had started as a birthday celebration now felt like an ambush, disguised as a business meeting. Brett eventually finished another series of slides and looked toward me expectantly. I'd be happy to answer questions. Nobody spoke. Kim crossed her arms again. Audrey stared at the floor. Ava looked confused. The silence stretched long enough to become awkward. Finally, I smiled politely. "Actually, I do have one question." Brett relaxed slightly. "Of course. Who is Neil Barker?" The change in his expression lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Surprise. Real surprise. Then it disappeared beneath a practiced smile. "Neil is a business consultant." A lie. Or at least not the whole truth. I had spent 40 years negotiating with landlords, suppliers, bankers, and investors. People reveal more through hesitation than through words. Brett's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "A consultant?" I asked. "Yes." "Interesting." I nodded slowly, because it sounded like he was waiting for me to sign something. The room became noticeably quieter. Brett laughed lightly. Too lightly. "You're reading too much into a notification." "Maybe, but I didn't think so." The presentation ended shortly afterward. Guests began leaving. Employees offered awkward birthday wishes before heading home. The decorations remained in place, but the celebration was clearly over. Kim stayed behind while the others cleaned up. "You okay?" she asked. I looked around the salon. "No." She nodded. "Me neither." For several minutes, we worked in silence. Eventually, Kim spoke again. "That wasn't about growing the company." I looked at her. "What do you think it was about?" Her answer came immediately. "Selling it." The certainty in her voice matched my own suspicions. Later that night, after everyone had left, I remained alone inside the salon. The building felt different after dark. Quieter, more honest. I walked through each section slowly. Reception, styling stations, training room, product displays. Every corner carried memories. I remembered painting some of those walls myself decades earlier. I remembered helping employees through divorces, illnesses, and financial struggles. I remembered Linda standing beside me when there was only one location instead of many. The idea that someone could reduce all of that into a transaction felt almost insulting. Before leaving, I stopped by my office and opened the company database. Neil Barker. The name didn't take long to find. My stomach tightened immediately. He wasn't a consultant. He was a managing partner at Barker Capital Partners, acquisition specialists, corporate buyouts, business consolidation. They purchased companies. They didn't advise them. They bought them. I continued reading. Barker Capital had acquired dozens of regional businesses over the last decade. In many cases, the original brand disappeared completely within 2 years. Employees were terminated. Locations were merged. Long-standing management teams were replaced. My pulse quickened as I studied the details. Then I found something even worse, a press release from 6 months earlier. Barker Capital had publicly announced plans to expand into the beauty and wellness sector. They were actively seeking acquisition targets. Acquisition targets. Suddenly, every slide in Brett's presentation made sense. The new company name, the restructuring proposals, the obsession with labor costs. None of it was preparation for growth. It was preparation for sale. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Then I opened my email. There, buried among dozens of messages, was something I had ignored weeks earlier. An invitation forwarded from Brett. At the time, I assumed it was another networking event. Now, I opened it. My blood ran cold. Barker Capital Executive Strategy Dinner. Special guest, Neil Barker. Date, 3 months ago. 3 months. 3 months before my birthday. 3 months before the presentation. 3 months before anyone supposedly began discussing possibilities. This wasn't an idea. This wasn't a proposal. This wasn't even a negotiation. It had already begun. And as I sat alone in my office staring at the evidence, I realized the most painful part wasn't that Brett had planned the sale behind my back. It was that someone else might have helped him do it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Founder risk. My photograph beneath those words. My own birthday transformed into a presentation designed to convince me that the company I spent 40 years building would be better off without me. By 7 the next morning, I was already sitting in my office at the flagship salon. The city outside was just beginning to wake up. Inside, I stared at the Barker Capital information displayed on my computer screen. Acquisition targets, brand consolidation, executive restructuring. The language sounded clinical, efficient, professional. It also sounded like the vocabulary people use when discussing assets instead of human beings. Around 9 o'clock, my office phone rang. I almost ignored it. Then, I noticed the caller ID. Barker Capital Partners. My pulse immediately quickened. I answered on the second ring. John Terry speaking. A confident voice responded. "John, good morning. Neil Barker here." I leaned back slowly. "Mr. Barker? Please, call me Neil." The man sounded friendly. Too friendly. Like someone who believed the outcome of a conversation had already been decided. "I wanted to personally congratulate you on an extraordinary career." I said nothing. Neil continued anyway. "What you've built with Terry Lotus is remarkable." Another pause. Then came the sentence I had been waiting for. "Brett tells me things are moving in a positive direction." There it was. Confirmation. Direct and undeniable. I looked out the office window while carefully choosing my next words. Interesting, Neil laughed lightly. I've been through dozens of transactions like this. Trust me, these decisions are never easy. Transactions. Not discussions. Not possibilities. Transactions. The man wasn't speaking hypothetically. He was speaking as though a sale already existed. Neil, I asked calmly, exactly what has Brett told you? Silence. Brief, but noticeable. Then Neil answered, my understanding is that your family has reached a general consensus regarding future ownership options. My stomach tightened. Consensus. Family agreement. Future ownership. Every phrase revealed another piece of the truth. And who gave you that understanding? Another pause. This one lasted longer. Brett indicated the family was aligned. Aligned? I almost laughed. Aligned. Nobody in my family had ever discussed selling the company with me before yesterday. Well, I said quietly, I think there may be some misunderstanding. The tone of the conversation shifted immediately. Neil stopped sounding confident. I'm sorry? No agreement exists. Complete silence. Then Neil spoke again, much more carefully this time. That's unexpected. Unexpected for him, not for me. We ended the call a few minutes later. Neil remained polite, but the certainty in his voice had disappeared. By the time I hung up, one thing was absolutely clear. Brett hadn't simply explored options. He had represented my family's approval, as though it already existed. Around noon, Audrey arrived at the salon unexpectedly. The moment she entered my office, I knew something had changed. Her expression looked different, not defensive, not distant, angry. Did you talk to Neil Barker? She asked. I nodded slowly. This morning, Audrey closed the door behind her. So did I. The room fell silent. She sat across from me and rubbed her temples. For several seconds, she couldn't seem to find the right words. Finally, she looked up. Dad, I need to ask you something. Okay. Did you ever tell Brett you wanted to sell the company? No. Did you ever authorize him to negotiate on your behalf? No. Audrey's face tightened. The answer clearly confirmed something she had already begun suspecting. That's what I thought. For the first time since the presentation, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing money, fear of discovering she had trusted the wrong person. She explained that Neil had contacted her shortly after our conversation. Apparently, he was confused by conflicting information. During that discussion, several details emerged that Brett had never shared with her. Meetings, projections, preliminary acquisition conversations, months of communication. Audrey stared at the floor. I thought he was exploring possibilities. Her voice sounded small. I didn't know he was presenting it as a done deal. Suddenly, several pieces fell into place. Audrey had been involved, but not fully informed. Brett had carefully controlled what she saw, while using her support to strengthen his position. Before I could respond, the office door opened. Brett stepped inside. He stopped immediately when he saw Audrey sitting there. The look on his face told me everything. He knew she had learned the truth. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Audrey stood up and faced her husband. How long? She asked quietly. Brett remained silent. How long have you been talking to Barker Capital? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. And judging by the expression on Brett's face, the answer was about to change far more than a potential business deal. How long have you been talking to Barker Capital? Audrey's voice was calm, but only on the surface. The kind of calm that exists right before something breaks. Brett stood motionless in the doorway. For the first time since the birthday presentation, he didn't seem to have a prepared answer. Audrey, he began carefully. This isn't the place for how long, she repeated. The office fell silent. Brett glanced toward me, then back at his wife. Finally, he exhaled. About 6 months. Audrey's face went pale. 6 months? He nodded. I was exploring opportunities. You told me 3 weeks. Brett didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. The realization hit her hard, not because he had spoken to investors, because he had lied to her, repeatedly, She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You used me. Brett shook his head. That's not fair. You told Neil the family supported the sale, because eventually they would. Audrey stared at him in disbelief. That's your defense? Brett stepped forward. Audrey, listen to me. This company needs to evolve. Stop talking about the company. Her voice finally cracked. I'm talking about us. Neither of them seemed to notice I was still sitting there. Years of frustration were suddenly spilling into the open. Brett rubbed his forehead. You know why I pushed this so hard? Audrey looked away. That reaction caught my attention immediately. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. Brett saw it too. Tell him, he said quietly. Audrey's jaw tightened. Don't tell him. The room became still. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Audrey slowly sat down across from me. She looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Like someone carrying something for years and finally running out of strength. When I was 12, she said softly, one of my classmates asked me what my parents did. I remained silent. I told her you owned salons. A bitter smile crossed her face. The next day, half the class was making jokes. She looked down at her hands. Nail jokes. Hair jokes. Immigrant jokes. I said nothing. Audrey continued. Every year it was something. Somebody's father was a lawyer. Somebody's mother was a doctor. Somebody's family owned investment firms. She laughed quietly, and I was the salon kid. Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. Not because I blamed her, because I had never known. Not once during all those years had she told me. Audrey shook her head. I spent my entire childhood trying to sound different from where I came from. The room remained silent. When people asked about the company, I changed the subject. When friends talked about prestigious careers, I felt embarrassed. Her eyes filled with tears. I know how terrible that sounds. It didn't sound terrible. It sounded human, painfully human. We all carry shame about something. The problem is, what happens when someone learns how to use it against us? Slowly, I turned toward Brett. I was beginning to understand. He wasn't the source of the wound. He had simply discovered it. Brett saw the realization on my face. I didn't create those feelings, he said. No, I replied quietly. But you fed them. He didn't argue. Because he couldn't. Audrey wiped her eyes. When Brett started talking about rebranding, expansion, luxury positioning, she laughed bitterly. It sounded like everything I wished the company had been when I was younger. There it was. The truth. Not greed, not money, validation. Brett had wrapped an acquisition proposal inside a lifelong insecurity. He made selling the company sound like correcting an old humiliation. You made me think we were fixing something, Audrey whispered. Brett looked genuinely frustrated now. Because we are. Audrey, look around. The market is changing. Legacy businesses don't survive forever. Then he turned toward me. John, with all due respect, sentiment doesn't protect companies. The sentence hung in the air. I looked around my office. Family photographs, employee awards, letters from clients, pictures of Linda, 40 years of memories reduced to sentiment. And yet a small voice inside me wondered if he was partly right. Not about selling, about time, about change, about succession. I hated that thought. Maybe because it frightened me. Maybe because turning 70 had forced me to confront questions I had spent years avoiding. What happens after me? What happens when I'm gone? What happens to Terry Lotus then? Brett sensed hesitation immediately. Predators always do. He reached into his briefcase and quietly removed the authorization folder again. This time he didn't slide it across the desk. He simply placed it there between us. Waiting. Audrey stared at it. I stared at it. The room felt impossibly quiet. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't looking at the folder with anger. I was looking at it with uncertainty. And that terrified me. Because, as my hand slowly moved toward the document, I realized Brett might finally be getting exactly what he wanted. My fingers stopped just inches from the authorization folder. The room felt completely still. Brett remained silent, confident that he had finally broken through my resistance. Audrey looked emotionally exhausted. I stared at the document lying on the desk, and hated the fact that part of me was genuinely uncertain. Not because I wanted to sell Terry Lotus, because Brett had successfully forced me to confront questions I had avoided for years. What happened when I was gone? What happened if the company truly needed leadership beyond me? What happened if my reluctance to change eventually became a burden? For the first time since the presentation, doubt had entered the room. Brett saw it immediately. "Nobody is asking you to make a final decision today," he said softly. "This only authorizes formal discussions." The tone of his voice had changed. Gone was the aggressive consultant from the birthday presentation. Now he sounded patient, reasonable, understanding. It was a performance, but a very effective one. "You deserve to know what the market thinks this company is worth." Audrey remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the folder. I slowly reached toward it again. Then a voice interrupted from the doorway. "If he signs that document, you'll spend the next 5 years in court trying to explain why you ignored Article 4. Every person in the room froze. Brett looked up first, then Audrey, then me. Standing in the doorway was a woman I hadn't seen in nearly 8 months, Harriet Sloan. For a moment, nobody spoke. Harriet wasn't the type of person people forgot. She was 73 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed the kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Even now, decades after building one of the most successful private investment firms in the state, she carried herself like someone completely comfortable being underestimated. Brett looked confused. Audrey looked surprised. I simply smiled. "You're late," I said. Harriet glanced at her watch. 3 minutes. Then she looked directly at Brett. "Which means I'm still earlier than your legal disaster." Brett straightened immediately. "I'm sorry. Who exactly are you?" Harriet walked into the office without answering. She placed a thick leather portfolio on the conference table and calmly removed several documents. Harriet Sloan. The name alone should have meant something. Judging by Brett's expression, it didn't. Harriet noticed. "That's unfortunate." She looked genuinely disappointed. "You probably should have done more research before attempting to sell a company." Brett crossed his arms. "I don't see what this has to do with anything." Harriet opened the first document and slid it across the table. "Then let's begin with that." Audrey leaned forward first. I already knew what was inside. Operating agreement, original formation documents, signatures dating back decades. Brett glanced at the paperwork without understanding what he was looking at. Harriet patiently waited. Then she tapped one paragraph near the bottom of the page. Article 4. Brett finally picked up the document. As he read, the confidence slowly began disappearing from his face. Harriet folded her hands. "Any sale, merger, acquisition, rebranding effort, ownership transfer, or controlling interest negotiation requires unanimous approval from all principal equity holders." The room became quiet. Brett looked confused. "And?" Harriet smiled. "And there are 2 principal equity holders." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Audrey frowned. "Dad owns the company." Harriet looked at her kindly. "Part of it." Then she pointed toward the document. "John owns 51%. Brett's expression immediately changed. 51? Harriet nodded. "Correct." Then she tapped another signature line. "I own 49. Silence. Complete silence. Audrey looked stunned. Brett looked as though somebody had physically struck him. Harriet sat back comfortably. "I've owned 49% of Terry Lotus for 37 years. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Brett laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "An interesting legal strategy. Unfortunately, reality tends to disagree." She opened another folder. More documents. More signatures. More records. Decades of records. Audrey looked at me in disbelief. "You never told me." I nodded slowly. "Because ownership was never the important part." Harriet smiled. "That's exactly why it worked." Brett flipped through page after page. His confidence was evaporating visibly now. "This doesn't make sense." Harriet leaned forward slightly. "No. What doesn't make sense is attempting to negotiate a sale without understanding who actually owns the company." Then her voice hardened for the first time. "You spent 6 months speaking to investors." She tapped the paperwork. 6 months building projections. Another tap. 6 months planning a transaction. Another tap. And somehow never bothered reading the operating agreement. Brett opened his mouth but couldn't seem to find words. Harriet wasn't finished. She calmly closed the folder and looked directly at him. The truly unfortunate part is that this isn't even the biggest mistake you've made. The room fell silent again. Because if Harriet Sloane was saying ownership wasn't the biggest problem, then something far worse was still waiting to be revealed. Nobody spoke after Harriet's final sentence. Brett sat motionless with the operating agreement still open in front of him. The confidence that had carried him through the birthday presentation was disappearing piece by piece. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, he looked uncertain. Harriet seemed completely unbothered by the silence. In fact, she appeared to be enjoying it. She calmly opened another section of her portfolio and removed a thick stack of reports. "Now," she said, "let's discuss your valuation." Brett straightened slightly. "The valuation was prepared by professionals." Harriet smiled. "I'm sure it was." Then she slid the reports across the table. "Unfortunately, professionals can still be wrong." Audrey leaned forward while Brett immediately began reviewing the documents. "I already knew what they were. Independent audits, asset reviews, property assessments. The kind of reports Harriet commissioned every few years, whether anyone asked for them or not." Harriet pointed toward the first page. "Your proposed sale value assumes Terry Lotus is primarily a service business." Brett frowned. "Because it is." Harriet shook her head. "Partly." Then she flipped to another page. "You counted revenue." Another page. "You counted labor." Another page. "You counted locations." Then she stopped. "What you failed to count is everything that actually makes this company valuable." The room grew quiet again. Harriet continued. "The flagship property is fully owned." Brett blinked. "What?" "No mortgage." Another page. "The North River location is fully owned." Another page. "The South Creek property is fully owned." Audrey's eyes widened. Even she hadn't known that. Harriet looked directly at Brett. "Your valuation treated those assets as leased operational space." Brett immediately began scanning his paperwork. The panic was subtle but visible. Harriet wasn't finished. "Then we have the education division." She pulled out another report. "The Terry Lotus Professional Training Program graduates approximately 120 beauty professionals annually." Brett remained silent. "Many of whom eventually work for competing organizations while paying licensing and certification fees." Another page. "A revenue stream completely absent from your analysis." The color slowly drained from Brett's face. Harriet kept going. "Then we have product distribution contracts." Another report. "Supplier incentives." Another report. "Brand licensing agreements." Another report. "Commercial partnerships." Another report. "Digital training subscriptions." Each revelation widened the gap between Brett's estimate and reality. Audrey finally looked at her husband. "You didn't know any of this?" Brett didn't answer. Harriet answered for him. Of course he didn't. The room became silent again. Harriet folded her hands. "Because he wasn't evaluating a company." Her eyes settled on Brett. "He was evaluating a spreadsheet." That sentence landed harder than any legal document. Because everyone in the room knew it was true. Brett never understood Terry Lotus. He understood numbers, revenue, expenses, multipliers, exit values. But companies are built from things spreadsheets can't fully measure. Relationships, trust, reputation, community. Harriet turned another page. This one contained a list of employee retention statistics. "Let's discuss your favorite topic." Brett looked exhausted. "What topic is that?" Harriet smiled. "Dead weight." The word instantly changed the atmosphere. Kim's face flashed through my mind. Harriet pointed toward the report. "Kim Liu." Brett looked away. Harriet continued anyway. 24 years of service." She flipped a page. "Responsible for training 32 current managers." Another page. "Retention rate among employees directly mentored by Kim exceeds company average by 41%. Another page. "Customer satisfaction scores among her locations remain the highest in the organization." She paused deliberately. "An extraordinary return for someone you described as dead weight." Audrey lowered her eyes. Brett said nothing. Harriet wasn't finished. Do you know why Terry Lotus survived the recession? Silence. Do you know why turnover remained low while competitors collapsed? Silence. Do you know why customers remained loyal after decades? Silence. Then Harriet answered her own question. People like Kim. The room felt heavier now. Not because Brett was losing an argument, because he was finally being forced to confront something he had never respected. Human value. Harriet closed one report and opened another. There's also a profit participation program. Brett looked confused. What? Harriet raised an eyebrow. You didn't know? That question alone told everyone everything. She turned the document toward Audrey and me. Several employee names appeared on the page, Kim among them. For nearly 12 years, selected senior leaders have participated in a long-term incentive structure tied to company performance. Audrey stared at the list. Dad. I nodded quietly. The people who helped build the company deserve to share in its success. Harriet smiled slightly, a concept surprisingly absent from most acquisition proposals. Brett leaned back in his chair and stared at the table. The man who arrived believing he understood Terry Lotus better than anyone now looked completely lost. Harriet calmly gathered her reports and organized them into neat stacks. Then she looked directly at him. The tragedy here isn't that your valuation was wrong. Brett slowly looked up. Harriet's expression hardened. The tragedy is that you never understood what you were trying to sell. And judging by the folder she reached for next, the most important revelation was still waiting inside it. The room remained silent after Harriet's last statement. Brett looked exhausted. Not physically, intellectually. Like someone who had spent months preparing for a battle only to discover he had been studying the wrong map. Harriet calmly opened the final folder resting on the table. Unlike the reports and legal documents that came before it, this one was much thinner. Yet judging by the look in her eyes, it was far more important. You keep talking about succession, Harriet said. Let's discuss succession. Brett slowly straightened in his chair. Audrey looked equally curious. I remained silent. Harriet placed several pages on the table and turned them toward the others. John has spent the last 7 years preparing for the future of Terry Lotus. Brett blinked. What? Harriet ignored him. Long before Barker Capital existed in this conversation, long before rebranding proposals, long before acquisition plans, she tapped the documents. There has always been a succession strategy. Audrey stared at me. Dad, is that true? I nodded slowly. Of course it is. She looked genuinely shocked. Then why didn't you tell me? I smiled sadly. Because planning for the future and selling the company aren't the same thing. Harriet pointed toward the first page. Leadership Development Program. The title alone seemed to confuse Brett. He had spent months assuming there was no plan. Now he was discovering the opposite. Harriet continued. Over the last 7 years, selected managers have completed advanced operational training, financial education, leadership development, and mentorship programs. Audrey studied the names listed on the page. Then her eyes widened. Kim? Harriet smiled. Yes. Another name. Tina Morales? Harriet nodded. Also yes. Tina had started with Terry Lotus at 19 years old. She now managed one of our fastest-growing locations. There were several others as well. People who had spent years learning every part of the business, not because they expected ownership, because they believed in the company. Brett stared at the documents. You're telling me managers are the succession plan? Harriet immediately shook her head. No. Then she looked directly at him. I'm telling you that leadership is the succession plan. The distinction mattered. A great deal. Harriet stood and slowly walked toward the photographs hanging on the office wall. Pictures from different decades, different locations, different teams. Most people misunderstand family businesses, she said. They assume the goal is transferring ownership from one generation to another. She turned back toward the room. The real goal is preserving values. Nobody spoke. Harriet continued. If the next generation earns leadership, wonderful. If they don't, the business still survives. Brett lowered his eyes. because for the first time he understood what this conversation was really about. It wasn't about family inheritance. It was about responsibility. Harriet returned to the table. Kim will transition into a senior advisory role over the next few years. She pointed toward another document. Tina is being prepared for expanded operational leadership. Another document. Several regional directors are already participating in executive decision-making. Audrey slowly turned toward me. You built all this? No, I replied quietly. We built it. That difference mattered. Terry Lotus had never belonged entirely to me. Not emotionally, not morally. Hundreds of people had contributed to its success. Harriet smiled, which is exactly why it remains valuable. Brett looked defeated now. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. Even the ambition seemed smaller somehow. Finally, he asked the question he had probably been avoiding for hours. So, what happens now? Harriet looked at him calmly. Now? She closed the folder. Now the company continues exactly as it was always intended to continue. Silence filled the room. Then, she added one final sentence. Without being sold. The words landed like a final verdict. Months of planning. Investor meetings, valuation reports, rebranding strategies, acquisition discussions. Everything collapsed in a single moment. Not because Brett was outsmarted, because he never understood what he was trying to control. Audrey sat quietly, staring at the succession documents. For the first time since the birthday presentation, tears appeared in her eyes. Not tears of embarrassment, tears of realization. She was finally seeing the company the way everyone else had always seen it. Not as a business to escape from, not as a symbol of childhood shame, but as a legacy built through sacrifice, loyalty, and trust. And as I watched my daughter absorb that truth, I knew the hardest decision of all still remained ahead of me. Because the future of Terry Lotus had been secured. The future of my family had not. For a long time after Harriet's announcement, nobody spoke. The succession plan sat on the table between us, like proof that some futures are built quietly, while everyone else is arguing about the wrong things. Brett stared at the documents. Audrey stared at the photographs hanging on the wall. I found myself looking at the birthday decorations that still hadn't been taken down. The balloons had begun losing air. Several ribbons hung crookedly from the ceiling. It felt strangely symbolic. 24 hours earlier, I thought this birthday would be remembered as one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it became the day everything hidden finally came into the light. Audrey was the first to break the silence. She stood slowly and walked toward the photograph wall. Her eyes moved from one picture to the next. The first salon, the grand openings, employee celebrations, charity events, training graduations, moments she had lived through but never truly seen. Finally, she stopped in front of a photograph of my late wife, Linda. I spent so many years being embarrassed by this place, she said quietly. I never stopped to ask why everyone else was proud of it. Nobody answered. There was nothing to add. Audrey turned toward me. Tears were running freely down her face now. I'm sorry, Dad. The room remained silent. Not just for yesterday. Her voice trembled. For years. She looked around the office. I let other people's opinions become more important than understanding what you built. I could hear genuine regret in every word. Not because the sale had failed. Because she finally understood the cost of what almost happened. Then something unexpected occurred. Audrey walked across the room toward Kim, who had quietly arrived earlier and remained near the doorway. Without saying a word, Audrey hugged her. Kim looked surprised. So did everyone else. I'm sorry, Audrey whispered. You deserved better from me too. Kim smiled sadly and squeezed her hand. Some wounds don't disappear instantly, but healing has to begin somewhere. Across the room, Brett remained seated. For once, he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't presenting another strategy. He wasn't explaining market conditions. He simply looked tired. Eventually, he stood up and faced me. I thought I was helping. The words sounded honest. Maybe for the first time during this entire ordeal. I nodded slowly. I know. Brett looked surprised by the response. Then why does it feel like I destroyed everything? I thought about that question carefully. Because you spent months trying to change something before understanding it. The room became quiet again. Brett lowered his eyes. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Deep down, he already knew it was true. A few minutes later, Harriet gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, she stopped and looked back at the room. Most companies fail because people chase value. Everyone listened. Harriet smiled. The best companies survive because they protect it. Then she walked away. It sounded exactly like something Harriet Sloan would say. Several weeks later, on what would have been an ordinary Monday morning, Terry Lotus announced a new initiative, the Terry Lotus Hands Scholarship. The program would help aspiring beauty professionals from immigrant and working-class families receive training, certification, and mentorship opportunities. The funding came from a small envelope containing $70. The same $70 my employees had collected for my 70th birthday before the celebration was interrupted. I kept every dollar exactly as it was given, not because the amount mattered, because the meaning did. Months later, I stood in the training center, watching the first scholarship recipients begin their journey. Some looked nervous, some looked excited. All of them reminded me of the young immigrant who once arrived with 2 suitcases and a dream. As I watched them, I realized something important. A legacy isn't a building. It isn't a brand. It isn't a valuation report or a sale price. A legacy is what remains when people choose to carry your values forward. Terry Lotus would continue. New leaders would emerge, new locations would open, new challenges would arrive. That was inevitable. But the heart of the company would remain exactly where it had always been, in the people. And as I looked around the room filled with employees, students, friends, and family, I understood something my wife Linda had known all along. Success isn't measured by what you can sell. It's measured by what still matters after you've chosen not to.